Well, hello, and welcome to Thingamajigs, the exciting history of mundane things. I am Ben.
And I am Danielle. Today's a special episode.
Is it?
Yes.
Why?
Because you are presenting our topic.
I am.
You are.
You could have gave me some advance notice.
I think that you had plenty of time.
I've had absolutely no time.
This is going to be a short one because we're a little short on time.
So I guess it's time to get into it.
Hey, Ben, what time is it?
7:14 p.m.
And how on earth do you know that?
Computers. Today we are talking about the internet.
I think we did that one already. You really like to bring up old topics that we've already done.
It's fun. Now we're going to be talking about the history of clocks. It's not an April Fool's episode, and it's also wasn't an easy one, but Danielle didn't want to do clocks.
I was very intimidated by clocks. They're very complicated.
They are. We'll get into it. A clock is something that is surprisingly hard to describe. Timekeeping has been around since the first people who realized that the sun and stars move in predictable ways.
Clocks are pretty easy to describe. I mean, you got a round face, 12 numbers, 2 arms. One of them's long, one of them's short. We don't know why.
We don't have any clocks in this room that resemble what you just said.
We have one in the bedroom that doesn't work.
Yeah. In a way, they're stars and sun wear their clock. So that doesn't fall into that description.
That would drive me absolutely mad. I need to know what time it is at all points of the day, and especially night.
Yes, that is why we invented technology, to defy the heavens. So where did that get us? Actually, not very far. We kept using stars for a very, very long time. Eventually, we switched to just one star, and it was the sun.
Seems like a pretty good one to go by, since it's, the biggest one, the closest one, the brightest one.
We're pretty sure, but we don't have records that go far enough back that people had been using the sun and shadows for clocks for a very long time. Just stick something in the ground and watch the shadows. You can draw some little lines for different times of the day if you want to.
I feel like we need to start a drinking game where every time you say time, we take a drink. Play along at home.
We will die. Naturally, that wasn't a very universal method for telling time. You couldn't really tell your friends to come over at shadow spot number 5 and expect them to all arrive around the same time. So at some point, around 1500 BC, we took that idea and standardized it, and thus the sundial was born.
I only count the sunny hours.
Have you ever seen a real sundial, in person?
No, not in person, only pictures.
Really? It occurred to me that, as far as I can remember, the only sundial I've ever seen was in my neighbor's backyard. It was a sweet old lady, Miss Sally, lived next door to us.
Oh yeah, she had that schnauzer.
Yeah, and she had a little sundial on a pedestal in her backyard. And I thought it was very fascinating, but then I was like, I wonder how many people have actually seen a sundial before. It's got to be a lot less now.
I can't really imagine why you would need one, other than just for the novelty of having an outdoor yard ornament, maybe.
Yeah, it was a pretty cool decoration, I think. It was like a stone pedestal, and the shape of the sundial is pretty cool looking, so I'd get one. Anyway, the sundial was a really big deal. It was very high tech at the time, and it got a lot of people interested in astronomy. We started trying to figure out how big the Earth was, and we started making more accurate maps using the angle of the sun. It was a technological revolution. And it really is just a thing sticking up that casts a shadow, but the lines are pre-inscribed now, so we have a standard universal time. Kind of. The simplicity of the sundial was its downfall. It wasn't as universal as you might hope, because it had to be oriented perfectly with the sun to actually have the shadow land on the right lines. And the orientation depends on where you are geographically, because the sun is at a different angle, not just if you're more east or west, but even if you're north or south.
So I guess if you wanted to know what time it was, you had to go to where the sundial was and read it?
Yep.
How do you tell everybody, hey, meet me at the sundial at such and such time, but you don't know what time that is until you get to the sundial? You just have to keep checking the sundial.
Well, I mean, you could have one in your yard. So you just step outside, look at the sundial, and oh.
I assumed not everybody was privileged enough to have their own sundial.
Well, surely not everybody. For the people who actually counted on it, it was mostly like businessmen and religious leaders or...
Yeah, we had to know what time to have church.
That's a recurring theme with clocks. I probably won't talk about it much, but a lot of the different clocks were invented and or refined for religious reasons. So they'd know like when to give sacrifice or how long they should be praying and stuff like that. That is an interesting part of it.
Sunday service will be held at Shadow number 5.
It's a bit late for Sunday.
Shadow number 5:30. Did they have half hours?
Shadow 7:38.
Okay.
So yeah, it was they all had clocks, but they were still practically impossible to actually synchronize. But around the same time as the sundial, another type of clock was being invented elsewhere. This clock, which would surely save us from the inaccuracies of the sundial.
Elsewhere has to be China. I feel like everywhere elsewhere is always China. Is it China?
Spoiler alert, it's China.
Oh my gosh, I got it right.
Yes, they invented the water clock. To compare the water clock to the sundial is kind of apples to oranges. There's really two types of clocks. There's a clock that'll tell you what time of day it is, like a sundial, or the clock on your microwave if you actually set it. Which you probably didn't. You should go set it.
Or if you have a microwave.
Fair enough. And the other clock tells you the passage of time, like a stopwatch.
So like how many hours have passed.
Right. That's where the water clock falls. In fact, that's where a lot of these clocks end up falling. But if you wake up every morning and start a stopwatch, it basically turns into a clock. So that's how most societies use these clocks.
Could you imagine that being part of your morning routine? Oh, I gotta start my clock for the day.
Yeah. They probably had to pay people to...
What if not everybody starts their clock at the same time?
That is a tough one. I'm not really sure how they synchronized these, but from what I read, it seems like a lot of it was to like know how much you should pay someone, because you just started at the start of the day and you're like, oh, that guy worked for 3 hours or whatever, so yeah, pay him. Let me describe first what the water clock actually is. So it usually took the form of a large pot with a small hole in the side toward the bottom, and the water would flow out at a steady rate, and they'd have markings on the inner side of the pot, or some of them had like little columns sticking up from the bottom, and whenever the water would go down to those marks or to the tops of those columns of different heights in the pot, that would tell you what time it was.
So like each marking had when it gets to this line, it's been 3 hours. When it gets to this line, it's been 8 hours.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's the outflow version. There's also the inflow version, which is just the same thing, but filling up to the markings instead of draining down. Yeah, you can see how it doesn't really tell the time. It's really just a stopwatch.
Man, you could really get away with getting paid extra if you just went over there and started scooping some water out.
That's true.
Brings a whole new meaning to wage theft. Sorry, I was thirsty. I thought if I've been working hard, I thought I could just drink this water. All of a sudden, you're getting paid more.
Yeah, but then back then, if you're caught stealing, they cut off your hand. So is it worth it? Maybe. I don't know. How much you getting paid? So they'd fill them up at the beginning of each day, and they even, in some places anyway, they would fill them up with different amounts throughout the year to account for daylight hours versus nighttime hours.
On hot days, it probably isn't as accurate because you're losing water in the air.
Yes, temperature is its biggest weakness.
Also, what if it rains?
That too, also a problem.
So, sundial, still the best option. Unless it's nighttime.
Yeah, the sundial was not so affected by outside influences. If it got too hot, the water would evaporate and time would move quicker if it was an outflow. I guess time would move slower if it was a inflow water clock.
Was the sundial affected by clouds, though? I mean, like if you had a bunch of clouds, you wouldn't be able to...
Yeah,
the shadows would be messed up.
Imagine if it was very cloudy. Probably have an issue.
Man, weather is really messing these people up.
You know, there's one clock that was like completely immune to outside influence. We'll get to that. You'll never guess which one it was.
Is it my iPhone? Actually, I don't have an iPhone. Is it my Google phone?
No.
Well, yes.
No.
My clock on my phone's not affected by outside.
Okay, go leave your phone out in the rain and the freezing weather and then in the sun and see if the clock still works.
All right. I see what you're saying.
And then on the other end, they getting too hot wasn't their only problem. If they got too cold, the water would freeze. So that was another issue in a lot of climates.
Oh no, time has stopped.
Time is frozen. Literally.
Aww, that makes frozen in time make sense. Like a literal sense.
Although I imagine only the top of it froze. So you'd have to I don't know. Anyway, a lot of people would have to heat their water clocks with torches throughout the night if they needed them at night. So that was a problem. But there is one less obvious effect of temperature on the water clock: viscosity.
Does water change viscosity?
Yes, it does. You might almost never notice it in your daily life, but when water is cold, it does get thicker, and whenever it'll run slower. And when it gets hot, it does get thinner and runs quicker. And whenever you're dealing with that much water flow, it becomes a big deal for your accuracy. Even if you had an extremely accurate version of the water clock, if your temperature changed by 1 degree Celsius, it could change your time by up to 30 minutes. Most of them, like I've said, were refilled at the start of each day. Most of them. So the effects of the temperature wouldn't compound day over day like influences on other clocks would. So that's nice, but if you live somewhere where it gets really cold at night and then gets real hot during the day, so especially if you were in kind of a deserty environment, your clock would be way off at the end of the day.
They're doing their best, though. I get it. It's difficult. You can't just sit there and count 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, a minute has gone by. Let's start over again. Like that episode, have you ever seen Solitary? Some of the challenges are you have to stay in this room for 4 hours or however many hours they tell you, but they don't obviously give you any way to count time, so you just have to figure out how to count time yourself.
I have seen that.
I would be terrible at that.
Everyone would be terrible at that. It's a really big flaw in the human brain. It is really bad at knowing how much time has passed in a given scenario because it's so relative.
Yeah, it's because the way your brain processes time depending on your environment is different. An hour at work is forever, but an hour at home, you look up and you're like, oh my gosh.
Where did that
go? Time flies when you're having fun.
Ophi agrees. But just like the sundial, water clocks were actually used for thousands of years. Mostly by China, probably.
Are they actually sure it was thousands of years, or did it just feel like thousands of years?
according to this water clock, it was thousands of years. Yeah, I think it was mostly in the Asias over there. There were a lot of attempts to make them more accurate and to add features. There's some major design changes over the years. Like, there was one, they changed the name of it. I forget what the name of it was because it was weird and I didn't want to feel like pronouncing that.
Oh, you don't want to pronounce something difficult, but you'll put a 3-part special in a best of me trying to pronounce things terribly. I see how it is.
Correct.
I'd like to see you pronounce, what was that church word that I had a hard time with?
Protestantism?
Protestantism.
Yeah. I'd never be able to do that. Yeah, there was this version of it, they put the water in a tube and like they made the nozzle go up and then down, and they put a weight on top of it that pushed the water out at a steady rate, and that weight that was on top would have like a little arrow on it that would point to a column with markings on it. It was neat.
They were just trying to make it complicated.
It seemed a little overcomplicated, but it probably worked much better than what they had.
Did they ever have clocks where, like, let's say something fills up until it's so full that it tips over, and then it starts over again? I feel like that would be a pretty good way of telling time. Every time this bucket empties, an hour has passed.
This version of the water clock had something that did implement that, but not quite as much. It had like a little gear at the bottom of the column with the markings on it, and a little water wheel that would fill up and then turn, and it would rotate the column. I don't think it actually helped. I think they were just making stuff up at that point.
Weren't we all?
But at any rate, it was better, and I imagine the little weight on top probably helped stop the evaporation. So that's something. Sometime around 500 AD, after we got really good at making candles, and by we, I mean probably China, as we mentioned, they were the best at everything. We figured out that if you use a specific consistent recipe for candle wax, you can get a candle that burns for a consistent amount of time, and anything that can do anything for a consistent amount of time can basically be a clock. So the first candle clocks were candles made to a certain length and marked every inch, and it would take about 20 minutes for the candle to burn down to each mark. You line up a few of them, you've got a set of candles that burn for exactly 24 hours. I also saw some that had little nails poked into the sides of them, so as the candle would burn down, the nails would fall out into the little metal tray under the candle, so you'd get that
ting.
Yeah, that audible indication of time passing.
I like that. I really like your watch. It beeps every hour. I use that. Even though it just sits in the house, I listen for it.
Yeah,
it really helps.
Hear that beep, you look up at the clock and you're like, oh, look at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There was one really cool candle clock by Al-Jazari. He was an Islamic inventor. He invented a lot of cool stuff. Put them all in books and told you how to make them. Cool guy. He wrote about it in the 12th century, and it used a counterweight that would push the candle up as it burned, and the wick would like be in a little hole on the metal top. And you could also attach the weight to a dial or a column of markings, so as the candle burned, the weight would go down and it would point at what time it was. So that was really cool. Candle clocks were pretty good since you could keep them in your house and know what time it was at a glance, especially at night. That was kind of an issue with, obviously, the sundial.
Yeah, I would imagine keeping time at night was very difficult for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah. And they didn't take up nearly as much space as the water clocks. They were much more compact. There was another clock invented about 100 years later that was very similar to the candle clock. It was the incense clock.
That's the thing that hippies burn, right? That makes smoky smells, and people are like, ooh, it smells so good, but actually it just kind of smells like smoke that someone put some essential oils in.
Why, yes, it is the things that they burn in very important religious ceremonies, yes.
Okay, well, hang on. I didn't mean religious ceremonies. I just meant, you know that store that everybody goes to that has all the dream catchers and isn't it called Susan's?
Probably somewhere. Do you want to guess where it was invented?
In the Middle East?
Sort of.
Egypt?
No. We're actually not entirely sure.
Indonesia.
But we think that it was either China or India.
Oh, India was going to be my next guess.
We found a lot of versions of them and writings about them and drawings of them from China. But there is some evidence that they originated from India and China just kind of took their idea and ran with it. At any rate, there were two main types of incense clocks. The stick incense clock was the one that was basically a candle clock, but it was kind of placed horizontally or at an angle on some kind of platform, and it would have notches carved into it to mark the passage of time. Or like the candle clock with the nails, they would have threads draped over it with two little weights on either end, and as it would burn, those weights would fall into a metal tray under it, so you get that audible indicator again. And they got the recipe down pretty good to make them burn at a steady rate. But the other kind, the powdered incense clock, was pretty unique. It was basically a long trail of incense powder that would slowly burn. Early versions of it were just placed along a metal or stone plate with lines etched in it, and as it burned over the lines, you'd know which time it was. But they got really fancy with them as time went on. They'd have these elaborate boxes with like little mazes on the tops of them, or like little staircases that went up, and the powder would follow the mazes, and and to mark the time, they would have pieces of wood or different incense smells or whatever would produce a noticeable difference of scent just kind of along the path.
Oh my gosh, are you about to go right? Oh, it smells like 8 o'clock.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
When you smelled whatever was burning, you'd know what time it was.
You know what? I like that. Then we need to bring that back. I want my clock. I want my analog wall clock to spritz a different smell every hour.
That'd be pretty cool.
I think we could sell that. I think people would buy that.
When you get those like Airwick automated things that just go off like every 30 minutes or whatever, just have it do a different smell each time.
Mm-hmm.
That would work. Yeah, it allowed for some really cool designs. Like they had an illustration of one in the book Time, the Familiar Stranger by Julius Thomas Fraser. It goes into a lot of detail about early clocks and their designs and their uses. I didn't have time to read through the whole thing, but it was pretty cool. You can borrow it on archive.org for free if you make an account. And I read, but was not able to confirm, that they had some that were so fancy and elaborate that they could burn for up to a month.
With different smells? Or did the smells rotate over again?
Probably rotated.
Okay. Smells like April 11th.
Have you ever heard of the hourglass?
I figured it would make an appearance in this episode.
It's a very well-known one, which I think is interesting because not a lot of people have seen sundials, and I'm willing to bet that very few people have seen water clocks. But everybody has seen an hourglass.
That's because they come with all of our favorite board games.
That's true. Although those are more like 10-second glasses.
True.
Maybe it's not fair to say we've all seen a hourglass.
I have. They seemed to be very popular decorative items for a while there. You could get one at Target. Nothing was more fun than going around the shelves and tipping all of the hourglasses over.
You know, I'm pretty sure that my neighbor, Miss Sally, who had a sundial, also had an hourglass in her living room.
She's real interested in ye olden time keeping.
Apparently so. I never realized it until now.
It's because she's so old.
If you somehow have not seen an hourglass, it's basically two glass bulbs that come to a point in the middle where they're joined. One half is filled with sand. You flip it over, the sand trickles down, and when it's done trickling, an hour has passed, and then you can flip it over and start the next hour. It was kind of the successor to the water clock. Because we started sailing a lot in the 14th century and we needed an accurate way of keeping time so we'd know how long to sail in a particular direction to get where we wanted to go, sand wasn't bothered much by temperature changes or the rocking of a boat. It could withstand weather. It is the perfect clock, really, truly. They weren't perfectly accurate, but it was accurate enough that if you knew how fast you were sailing, you could figure out where you were.
We need 24-hour glasses.
That'd be pretty sweet. I'd buy one of those just for fun.
It'd take like 5 sailors just to tip the thing upside down to start it over again, but it would be pretty cool.
Nah, you put it on like one of those inversion table frames.
Yeah.
It started to get popular on land as well, but around that time people were trying real hard to invent mechanical clocks, so it didn't last that very long in the hearts of the land people.
Land people. Can't imagine they went around talking about themselves as land people.
What do you mean, fellow land person? And speaking of mechanical clocks, the big breakthrough for mechanical clocks is attributed to Leonardo da Vinci in the late 1500s when he introduced the pendulum into the equation. Galileo refined the work on the pendulum and clocks were popping off.
Pendulum had to bring a incredible accuracy to clocks that they hadn't seen before. The pendulums are awesome.
They were pretty great. They were still slightly affected by temperature changes, but like basically just as far as changes in friction in the air and as far as metal expansion in different temperatures, so it wasn't nearly as bad.
Also, the birth of hypnosis.
Yes.
Because pendulums.
Somebody sat there staring at his clock and he accidentally hypnotized himself.
Yeah.
That's how it started.
That's how it started. Then every clock came with those warning labels. You know, like we currently have warning labels for flashing lights in visual media. They probably had like little warning labels on the pendulums.
If you are susceptible to hypnosis, consult a doctor before watching clocks. So what is a pendulum? Why does a mechanical clock need one?
So that it goes tick, tick, tick.
Yes, very good. And that is how clocks work. Thanks for listening, everyone. I wish. A big part of what makes this topic so intimidating, like you said earlier, is having to try to explain how clocks work. Because from this point in time, there were a lot of different mechanisms involved, and they kept getting more and more complicated. So I'm going to try to give a very high-level explanation. The easiest way to see how they work is to actually see how they work. So if you want to know how they really work, I would suggest going on YouTube and looking for some slick animated explanations.
High level?
Yes, high level means, like surface level. Think of it like water. High level.
That's not what I would have. That's not how I would have guessed that meant. I would have rathered you say, I'm going to give a very layman's term.
I'm going to give a very simple explanation. So how they worked at this time is it would have weights on ropes that were connected to a gear that was locked in place by a little catch hook thing. So the gear can't turn, but the weight is pulling down on it like weight does.
Gravity.
Yeah, they had a lot of gravity in the clocks. I don't know how they packed it all in there. But the pendulum would be attached to the catch that is holding the gear in place. So as the pendulum would swing, it would release that catch and let the gear move forward exactly one tooth, and then it would swing back and catch, and then swing, and then release, and the weight would be pulling down each time to turn that gear. That's the essential function of the mechanism. There's a lot that goes into it. But yeah, they were a lot more accurate. Still a little affected by temperature, but not as bad. And clocks went on like that for a few hundred years. They added some fun features like the bells that would chime when the time changed. Those are always fun. But then we started figuring out electricity. And you don't need weight hanging in your clock if you just stick a motor in it. Easy peasy. But then, as we continued experimenting with electricity, things got kind of weird.
We electrocuted an elephant.
Yes, among other things. As well as electrocuting an elephant, in 1880, Jacques and Pierre Curie were playing around with quartz in a very scientific way, I'm sure, and they discovered piezoelectricity. Are you familiar?
No, cannot say that I am familiar.
Well, that's weird, because you're using it all the time. It is a very weird physical phenomenon where certain minerals and crystals can move when given electricity. So they were kind of like tiny, tiny motors, but it was just a crystal. If you take some quartz crystals and you trap them in a small space and you give them electricity, they oscillate back and forth very, very fast.
Oh, that is super weird.
Yes, it is super weird. They also use piezoelectrics in other applications. One of the more recent ones that's coming up, I think, is really cool, is piezoelectric cooling systems. So if you have like a small, really compact computer that you need to stick somewhere, but you need to cool it, they have these fans made of piezoelectric materials that produce a really strong airflow without any real moving parts.
What?
I mean, obviously there's moving parts. There's crystals in there somewhere that are moving very, very fast, but because they're moving so fast and they're so small, it can produce a strong airflow in a very small thing with like no moving fins or anything, like no fan blades.
That is so weird.
It's very cool.
I feel like that shouldn't exist.
It shouldn't. It's a glitch and it's an exploit of the physics system. I don't know. They need to patch this, dude. Literally unplayable. And we kind of relatively quickly realized you could use this for a lot of different stuff. Today, they're in pretty much everything. They're in all the computers. They're in every clock. They're in a lot of different things that need to do actions repeatedly. So like every computer is controlled by crystal oscillators. It's what actually tells your processor and your computer to do something.
This is why I did not want to cover this topic. He's explaining it to me and I'm still flabbergasted at what he's saying.
It's fascinating. It is. I suggest some light piezoelectricity reading. And yeah, obviously a few years later, people were already sticking these in clocks because they realized they could keep a clock moving for an insanely long amount of time with a very small electric current. And in 1927, Joseph W. Horton and Warren A. Morrison, working at Bell Labs, built the first quartz clock. And this, once again, created a boom in the industry. A lot of advancements in the clock industry.
Do I have a watch that says quartz on it?
Probably.
I think I might.
If you have a watch, it probably has quartz in it.
I never knew that that's why it said that.
Yeah. Watches, whether they're analog or digital, these days they pretty much all use crystal oscillators. So yeah, now everybody can suddenly have a clock that they can just mount to a wall, stick a couple batteries in it, and forever forget the days where they ever had to wind up their clock.
My mom still has wind-up clocks. She specifically seeks out wind-up clocks, and she winds them every Saturday.
She hates crystals.
Well, don't you know that crystals are of the devil? No, I think she really just likes the noises that they make. She likes to hear time pass.
Yeah, the winding of the clock, by the way, if I remember correctly, that's rewinding the weight around the gear. In the 1960s, they got the crystal oscillators small enough to go in a pocket watch, and then a wristwatch. And they got more accurate through the 70s, and we figured out LCD screens, and they got digital. But there's one more clock. The ultimate clock. Around the same time as the quartz revolution, if you will, we also invented the atomic clock.
Nope. That sounds bad. I don't like that.
No, it's not. It's not spooky.
Okay.
It's good. It's a good thing. It's very cool. They are currently the most accurate clocks in existence, and they're pretty bonkers. They actually measure the resonant frequency of atoms.
They detonate every hour. You hear that big boom? Oh yeah, it's 4 o'clock.
Basically, atoms are constantly bouncing around like billions of times per second, and atomic clocks measure that bounce because it's always in a predictable interval. Possibly the most predictable interval in our universe. Because for reference, a high-quality quartz clock will lose a second or two per year of accuracy. An atomic clock will lose a few seconds every few trillion years. So as far as standardized time goes, we usually rely on atomic clocks that are synchronized with the internet. So all of our phones and whatnot all keep the same exact time to a second. So that's how your phone knows what time it is. Now, of course, it only took about 1,000 years for all of that to become irrelevant, when in the late 30th century, Professor Bartholomew Quirk built his first time machine. He and his robot worked tireless nights in the lab.
Oh, I bet they did have long, tireless nights.
After a couple incidents involving a misplaced decimal point and a herd of stampeding elephants, he finally...
Elephants?
Well, yeah.
Were they running? Were they running away from the elephants?
You didn't read about it?
I must have missed that one.
He finally cracked the code and came back to the year 2204 to tell us all about it, ruining our perception of time forever. At least that's according to Sir Percival Puddingbottom, the time traveler from 2204.
Bottom.
Yes. And that's it for clocks. That last bit.
What day is it? Is it April Fool's?
Oh my, yes.
That was an April Fool's joke.
I had to work in something. It's kind of hard because I wanted to do clocks because you didn't want to do clocks. Clocks aren't very funny.
That all depends on what kind of clock you have. I've seen a clock that was hilarious. It was Mickey Mouse and his arms were all messed up. He needed to go to the doctor because his arms were all broken.
Okay. I do have one fun fact. Paris used to use a system of air-powered clocks. They were having a lot of success with pneumatic mail and other air-powered equipment at the time, so I imagine they were very pleased when they saw these clocks in action in 1877, because just 3 years later, the pneumatically synchronized clocks began operation. They were installed on these tasteful metal posts around the city of Paris, and they had a distributing clock. It was kept accurate, I guess manually, and every minute it would release compressed air through a series of tubes that ran all throughout the city, 2 clocks on the other end, and it would move the minute hand forward 1 minute. They were a lot more complicated than that. They had like bellows, and it was like a 20-second pulse, and then it would fall down, and there would be a lot to get into. So, and they even offered public access to the system, so you could have one installed in your business or home for a recurring fee. And there were somewhere around 2,000 clocks in service, but they decided to shut it down in 1927. Oh, and there's also Big Ben. Big Ben is not the name of a clock in London. The clock tower which is called the Elizabeth Tower, by the way, it has 5 bells, and Big Ben is the nickname of the largest bell. It's one of those fun facts that you get to really get on people's nerves with when they say the wrong thing. You're welcome.
What's the oldest still running clock? It's also in London. It's like from 1363.
Yeah, it's an old clock in a cathedral somewhere.
Fact check that. I know it's from the 1300s, but I don't remember if it was 1363.
It is in the Salisbury Cathedral. Is the Salisbury Cathedral clock in England from 1386. The world's oldest working clock.
I mean, come on. From memory, that was pretty good. I knew it was 1300s.
498 years.
That's a long time.
Ticking more than 500 million times. It does not look like a clock that you would recognize, by the way. It is not a modern clock by any means.
I wouldn't assume so from that time frame.
Well, that's it. That's all I got. You got anything? PSAs?
No, not really. I'm a big fan of setting my clocks forward a bit so that I'm more on time for things, but Ben is very against that.
I used to set all my clocks forward exactly 3 minutes, and I found that it would make me on time for more things. But then I liked to actually know what time it was, and
that's why you have your phone.
At the time, it was probably a flip phone or a slide phone.
See, we leave the house off of whatever time the microwave says, but if you want to know what time it actually is, you just look at your phone.
Yeah, our microwave is always fast, and our other clock is always slow. So
Ophi's feeder is also always a little slow. She gets real mad about it, too. I think she knows when it starts drifting.
They need to calibrate their quartz. I used to be really into clocks. Found an old clock at a garage sale for like $10, and it ignited a passion in me.
Well, then you'll be happy to know that there will be many clocks in my inheritance from my mother.
I'm not that into clocks anymore.
Well, buddy, they're coming.
Honey, you got a storm coming. What is that? How's that go?
Honey, you've got a big storm coming.
Thank you, Ben, for bringing this topic. I'm really good at history. I am very bad when things start getting super technical like this, so I'm very thankful that you brought this topic for everybody. You have done a much better job than I would have.
I think you would have done fine. You're great. But it was my pleasure. Sort of. It was a lot. I'm never doing this again. This is the last episode of the podcast. Goodbye, everybody. This is another April Fool's joke. Ha ha.
I enjoy bringing fun historical information about mundane things, except for when those things are not exactly mundane and incredibly complicated.
Yeah, it was a lot to organize chronologically, funny enough. Well, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Thingamajigs and another exciting history of a mundane thing. I'm a ghost now. I don't know, man. Happy April Fool's Day.
And Easter.
And Easter. Don't forget to grab a goose and come back next week at shadow number 5.
If it smells like Monday, there's probably a new episode dropping.
Thanks for listening.
Nah, go!